Ready to roll? All right. All right, welcome back for our final session of the day. Appreciate everybody hanging in there. A lot of information today, but I'll invite our panel down to discuss the government business nexus, chaired by our friend Guidon Friedman, also with Mirel Ilhaj, Andy Ott, and Fergus Herodance. And Chris Train will be joining us. He texted me that he no pun intended, he actually got stuck on a train. So he'll be here as soon as the unsticks the train. He's on his way. I'll turn it over to you, Guidon.
So as we said, we cannot move without our cell phones anymore. And I'm trying to minimize the printouts nowadays. So let me first repeat the title of this session, the government business or government private sector interaction on resilience. But I do want to put a little emphasis here. It's on the background of R2P, of this transition to clean energy. So we're talking about things that we want to do along with the energy transition, the resilience that we want to achieve along with the energy transition, and how government and business can work together better. So I will, the way we will work is I will ask a few questions of the panelists. They each you will get a chance to answer. If people want to add a comment, and raise your hand, we'll add you into the discussion. I will start with the general question, so everyone can first present themselves and maybe emphasize the one point that they want to share with us, and later on I will ask slightly more specific areas where government and business can cooperate or need to cooperate, and how. And so this is how it will work. So I will start with the general question of what is essentially the role of government and the role of business for achieving better resilience. And you can think about several categories of things like innovation, execution of plans, setting specifications, for example, requirements. If you can give examples, it's usually very useful to understand things. In the examples, we could see what is a good collaboration and maybe something that we need to learn from in terms of collaboration. So why don't we start with that, Muriel? Yeah, please present yourself again, even though some people.
So thank you. My name is Mireille Elhaj, and I'm the CEO of Astrotera. It's a company that specializes in smart city solutions with emphasis on P&T. I'm also an advanced research fellow at Imperial College London. So I believe that it is the role of the government to really own the issue of resilience, especially from a leadership point of view, from policy and regulation. While the private sector is more concerned about innovation. However, there's a very important role that the government could play in de-risking those technologies that do not make immediate profits, where also like the private sector could scale up these technologies eventually by making money and refining these technologies. In terms of example, I could think of, for example, the launches of NASA, which happens every like 12 to 24 months. While, for example, SpaceX with its Falcon 9 has been launching like maybe every week due to the new technology. So this is where government helped, let's say, a private sector company achieving a new technology, which is quite innovative and very useful to us. Thank you.
It's actually an interesting example because the space was controlled completely by government, by NASA in the past, and I think we see that private sector in execution here was much better. But on the other hand, the question is whether the process of maturing the technology really benefited from the fact that it was done under government support. So it's an interesting example. Thank you, Muriel.
Yeah, certainly I agree. I think government setting policy and setting standards, sort of setting the target, if you will, hopefully reasonably. And I think certainly the private sector is fantastic at innovation. I think also risk taking. I think usually private corporations have a better idea of how to, quote, especially in technology, take technology risks and smart technology risks and do it efficiently. I just feel that governments don't do that as well. And so I think carving out that space is probably the best place to start.
Fergus.
No, I agree. I think that the role of government, it has to be to set the overall policy framework. Yes, to pass the necessary legislation, create the regulations and rules that define how the market operates. And it ultimately, in the case of infrastructure, I think has to be the body that acts as a sort of convener and brings people together so that you develop a collective understanding of what resilience actually is, what it is we're looking to deliver, and then ultimately government as customer, which we are in relation to lots of different types of infrastructure, we actually have to be willing to procure not only the infrastructure itself, but all of the other elements that we might want to add, like data or additional systems, additional resilience, and be the people who work out how you can create procurement frameworks that will accommodate that kind of innovation. And if government is effective in creating that kind of effective and functioning market, and also making sure some of the other supporting elements of the business environment, skills development, things like that function reasonably well and support investment in infrastructure and infrastructure delivery, then that's the point where you expect the private sector to step up with innovation, more effective operation, and providing that degree of customer focus and looking at what it is that all the commercial stakeholders in the system are actually going to want, need, and be willing to pay for.
But what about, is it always possible for the government to define the specifications? Because this is a challenging, job. It's not so easy. So where is it? Where's the play between the government and the private sector, even in setting the requirements?
I think setting those specifications is more challenging now than it was maybe 10 or 20 years ago. I think
today it's very challenging.
I think in 2030 it's more challenging than 2023. 2040 is potentially even more challenging. And when you think that what we are trying to do is really set specifications for an asset that in most countries you would be building with a 50, 60 year lifespan at a minimum, probably more realistically. Being British, I mean, in relation to our infrastructure, we say 60 years, but the reality is we've probably been 200 years, given the rate of replacement and the fact that we tend to really use infrastructure in this country until it literally falls apart. It is very difficult, I think, now to define what it is we want. And what that means is that we have a responsibility for making our best case. It's not simply trying to do what we've done in the past. It is trying to design things that can be, or specifications that will be fit for the future. But it's also engaging with the private sector and discussing about how we can build more flexibility into some of these specifications and the ability to adapt. And that isn't about government dictating. I think it's about government facilitating the conversation with the private sector, because the private sector has its own long and short-term drivers, economic, capability related and other things. It's about working out what is, I guess, a viable modus operandi for both sides that can last for a period of time, and then agreeing how we'll review it, how we'll change it, and how we'll embed some flexibility in the approach to delivering and operating assets.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think at least in Israel, we try to hold discussions continually all the time to listen to the private sector, and a lot of the ideas actually come from the private sector. So the initiation often, surprisingly or not, comes from the private sector. There's demand, and then regulators starts to think about it. And yes, we need to do it much quicker in a flexible way. This is a big challenge, and we can continue to discuss it. But I'll raise an additional question here with respect to this. Okay, so we see that the government role is quite challenging in setting the direction and setting requirements and how we want to be flexible, all of that. How can the government personnel be competent enough to handle this as compared to the private sector, where, again, at least in Israel, I believe in most of the Western world, the private sector offers much better, let's say, pay or much better work environment than the government. What should we do in order to get both sides competent enough?
How should I be politically correct? I think part of the challenge with governments too is the term of office of might as well just deal with it with the elephant in the room, so to speak. In many countries, the length of term in the office doesn't really lend itself to being getting deep knowledge of any specific area, and so the notion of policy shift, the political, if you will, divide, if you will, that many countries are experiencing, certainly in spades in the U.S., but also here. And I think so that is another dimension. Probably the best, is this almost partnership between industry and government to try to moderate some of that. But the policy shifts really stifle innovation, as we've seen. And I think the lack of ability to maintain a policy over time because government changes can really create a significant barrier.
Thank you. I definitely agree with this.
Always, yeah, I try to not only point the problems, but if you have ideas on what needs to be done.
Cheesy idea for now.
Maybe because innovation comes from the private sector. Usually workers in the private sector are more innovative, are more informed, and they're more, and the private sector is more focused on certain subjects. What could be not, I don't know if public-private partnerships are the answer, or more, I don't know, international, government schemes for training. I'm not really sure, but these are the ideas I could think of.
Yeah, I think certainly from our perspective, we try to create a so in other words, we're funding research to try to help, if you will, create technologies that wouldn't otherwise be created. So in other words, instead of having to have it be in the U.S. case a national lab or a government type funded, trying to create some kind of win-win situation to try to get through some of the, I'll say, difficult phase with some big companies can take on some of that risk. And that's what I meant about risk management. It's if we see a potential into the future that this could turn profitable, we're willing to lose money for a while, and I think other companies do that. So that's one particular way that companies can try to help with some of that, if you will, some of the difficulty in policy shifts or difficult. Dealing with that type of risk. So that's one.
How about if private companies sort of have a way to lend personnel to the government for a 4-year term or a 5-year term? You leave the company, but you are guaranteed that you can return or something like this. Is that something that makes sense?
Anybody, you want to give a comment on that?
Yeah, we've certainly done that kind of thing, not for that period of time, but certainly shorter term secondments, or we've recruited people from the private sector for specific roles. The alternative is you can set up some delivery structures which have a little bit more flexibility in terms of pay terms and conditions that they can offer, which we've done, for example, for some of the mega projects that we funded in the UK, like the high speed to rail.
You have like a special position title or something like this?
Effectively, it's a publicly owned company that exists to deliver the a particular project, but it's not. It might be funded by the public or largely funded by the private sector, but it doesn't operate within the same set of rules, and it has more commercial freedom. But I think really the challenge that you've got to crack is more of a cultural one than anything else. What I think would be good is if industry understood that if you have a capable, intelligent customer within government and the public sector, you are likely to get better outcomes in the longer term and a more sensible and engaged conversation, particularly about some of the thorny issues like innovation or risk or some of the commercial elements, than you are if you're dealing with people who are less capable, who are more likely to be worried about what risks they're exposing themselves to, and are probably more likely to be influenced by considerations like the legal advice that they're receiving. So I think that's the big change that I would like to see. It's that understanding that there is a mutual interest in having a dialogue between intelligent adults or intelligent organisations in this area, and that will ultimately benefit everybody.
Okay. Yes, sure, Washington.
Let me get one of them.
You want this?
Yeah. So thank you. A significant amount of innovation takes place in universities and startups, small companies and so on. And they're more likely not to have capital, funding and so forth. So the question is, particularly let's say from AstraTerra's perspective, as an SME, what are the challenges there in terms of ensuring that the startup culture? I know the United States with Silicon Valley and all of that, work pretty well, but in the rest of the world, maybe not necessarily so. So what is your experience so far? Let's say from a UK perspective, but also beyond the UK, because I think soon, if we haven't started already, we should be talking about global critical infrastructure or critical global infrastructure as opposed to critical national infrastructure because of things like supply chains and so on. What are the challenges there as an SME wanting to innovate in the resilience space, and what can the rest of us nationally and internationally do to help a startup or an SME like AstraTerra, for example?
Maybe I'll add to that the question that I had for for later, but it sort of ties, I think, pretty well. Which was what's the role of innovation for resilience, and where should it come from?
Well, in the UK, I think we're moving in the right direction because we have certain research bodies funding bodies, who are helpful for SMEs. My company benefits from one. It's Innovate UK, for example. There's the EPRSC for research funding as well. But I don't see, now that we have also a UK national strategy for space, there's more and more funding schemes happening. But we don't have the equivalent of Silicon Valley, where everything is consolidated in one place with very transparent information and schemes. And we need that. We need more of this. I think also we need more international collaboration because most of the grants and the funding is happening in the UK with UK companies and UK people. And sometimes I see that we might want to hire somebody from outside the UK, or it might be even more cost efficient for us to use somebody from outside the UK with the right expertise, and it's not yet in place. So I believe if we have more international collaboration, it could be one of the helpful things.
Yeah, I can tell a little bit about Israel because we also have an ecosystem for innovation, not specifically for resilience, of course. But the government is actually pretty strongly supporting early stage innovation, both in the academic environment, applicative research and early stage startups. And also there is, let's say, a culture that developed over time with the government, originally with more government support, and now it's more of a standard. But the culture is that after a few success stories, everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. So there's a push from the bottom to do it, and the system allows it. And it's also quite acceptable to fail. This is something that's very important for innovation. And it's okay to fail. And in fact, if you are an entrepreneur who failed even 2 or 3 times, you have a much higher chance of raising money than a person coming for the first time, really. So this is the situation. So failure is okay, and people accept it. So it's also important, I think, for the ecosystem of innovation. You wanted to say something? Yeah.
Well, one area we think about is in order to, if you will, this is such an immense problem. The problem we're facing is enormous. No one entity is going to solve it, and so part of our thinking is, I use the term, Google Maps for the grid, but it's creating a platform that enables innovation similar to what, for example, Google Maps does for Uber or Lyft or wherever. And this notion that we have of we're not going to be the best at everything, but if we create, a space, if you will, a platform, and invite, innovation, it lifts everybody up. So this notion of all, rising tides lift all ships or boats or whatever. I don't know if I can complete that one, but so one of the concepts we had, and again, this is trying to pair up with governments, because some governments hear the word, for example, Google, and they want to make sure that it's the platform is correct. So I think that type of thinking, though, that is the problem is such a scale that there's plenty of room, is another opportunity space that I think the industry needs to consider.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, when it comes to supporting innovation, government has a wide range of roles which are essential. It funds the majority of fundamental research. That will never change. The private sector won't do that. It provides important incentives for investment through R&D by firms. It provides venture capital support. It provides some innovation infrastructure, whether that's in university or technology and innovation centres. But actually, I think in relation to infrastructure, government has a particular role, which is that often innovations in relation to infrastructure, and it's true also in large construction projects, are seen as intrinsically higher risk because of the potential cost and the potential consequence of what could go wrong. So actually, as an infrastructure owner, manager, overseer, regulator, I think government has a particular responsibility to make sure that you've got the right policy framework in place and the right operational systems in place to enable the controlled testing of innovations in real operating environments. And that's something that we have been trying to do. We sort of experimented a bit in the water industry in collaboration with private firms. We've done bits of it in relation to the energy industry and some of our investments to ensure that offshore wind developments happen, particularly in the early stages. One thing that we're looking to do over the next few years is set up a rail research and innovation centre where you can actually have the opportunity to trial new innovations without needing them to run them on the railways, with the risk of consequential disruption if you get things wrong. And we also want to extend that so you can start looking at things like energy systems and the interaction of energy systems or renewable energy generation and energy storage with rail. So I think there is a particularly important role that government has in relation to infrastructure and supporting innovation in those sectors.
I agree. And also, we are also debating on this in Israel, how to do pilots with new technology, where often the regulation is either unsupportive of that or not fitting or non-existent. And so what do you do? And for example, at the Ministry of Energy, but together with the Public Utility Authority, which is the electricity market regulator in Israel, we set up a mechanism whereby you can request a special pilot that will not abide by the current rules. So you can actually have something that is outside the current regulation. You need to request, there's a certain procedure, for example, that goes through me. Okay, the chief scientist is like, I give it a stamp of something innovative, and then you can try to do a pilot without meeting all the the current regulatory requirements, and this actually helps setting the new regulation, because you learn from experience. We were not so successful, I have to say, with other branches of the government in doing this. I think it's required in all government regulators. For example, in Israel, land issues are very difficult, and planning issues also are quite difficult. So if you want to do a pilot and you want to do it quickly today, you can't go through a 5-year planning process for a small pilot plant. So we need to be a little more flexible, but certainly piloting, the government has, I think, a very important role nowadays to push innovation by allowing pilots and allowing to set the new regulation. And of course, the goal is to have flexible regulation, but I think this is very, very difficult. We will always look into the past, and it's very difficult to see the future and what will happen. So let me go to the next question. And I would say one more thing I wanted to say is with respect to cyber, it will tie me to the next question. So we have actually, as the Ministry of Energy, supported opening a cyber laboratory, let's say, where the idea originally was that software companies can come and test. Okay, can come and test their software on a digital twin if you want, but a complete setup that's already there in place with hardware in the loop that was mentioned, that you mentioned before, and all of that that's ready there, and like a gas-fired plant simulation or whatever is needed. So we are just actually, this is going to open up very, very soon. It's been built. It has been built, and it's ready to launch. So this is okay. It will tie me to the next question, and then we can. Okay, maybe you should ask the question first.
So, government, procurement, innovation, and research. There is a big disconnect. So if you think about Innovate UK and UKRI, money, the effort put into addressing solving big societal challenges, and more often than not, those big societal challenges around collaboration, ecosystems, whether it's green, resilience, terrorism, CNI, whatever, and procurement does not reflect that in no way, shape, or form. And whenever any organisation is looking to be, and there's a market dialogue, market engagement gone out, as soon as you start to try and get into that shaping of requirements, things like that, you start to fall foul of, you can't engage with the client, you can't open up a dialogue, you fall foul of procurement rules and things like that. So there is a complete misalignment between the outputs that happen in organizations like here and how they are addressing societal challenges versus how the requirements and the commissioning and the design of those commissioning are agile and flexible. Complete disconnect, probably a decade behind. So, so I would argue that whoever is responsible for procurement in their silos, they need to understand changes in society, and you understand the changes in society here, you understand what the outputs are coming, and then you think, you know, those people then need to think about how on earth are we going to change the design of our commissioning procurement to respond and be ready and to be aligned with those innovations, which more often than not will be collaborative, ecosystem-based, and will reflect, you know, so many SMEs, which ultimately they can't afford to take the risk, so they're going to be working with either universities or primes like us and so on. So, you know, collaboration at a public, private, academic, strategic level is great. Practitioners on the ground is great. There's that big chunk in the middle, which is not fit for purpose.
So I'll just repeat very briefly for those who may have not heard, the procurement process is very difficult in the government, and how do you bridge this gap? I will say a word before you answer, if you don't mind, because it's one of the challenges we have, and I've had several meetings actually with the Israeli government procurement department at the finance ministry, unsuccessfully mostly, I have to say, but there could be a way where that by the word pilot or you know an experimental stage, you could overcome the standard procurement process and allow for non-competitive bidding. You know, just give the money, purchase this new technology, which is inherently there's no competition if it's something new. We were only partially successful. We can. I have, as a chief scientist, Ministry of Energy, the ability to give a stamp of innovation, let's say, in renewable energy. It helps a little bit in the procurement, but not up to the point that I would like. I would like to see allowance to purchase like 1, 2, 3 systems if they got an innovation stamp from a government official. That would make things a lot easier. I haven't been able to do it yet.
I think you're right, there is a disconnect, but the reason that there's a disconnect is because procurement is often in a completely different organisation from the one that's responsible for supporting innovation. And secondly, because procurement is seen as the functional bit that we have to do when all the important policy decisions and other decisions have been taken by people in other organisations or more senior people in the organisation. And what we found is the way of overcoming this. It's you have to involve people who are responsible for procurement or regulation actually in the process of innovation. So there's no problem with that discussion because it's not a procurement discussion. You're not breaking any rules. You're not contravening any proprietary frameworks around regulator or procurer behaviour. You're having a conversation about possibilities and technologies and products that might come to market over a particular period of time. And we've done this quite successfully in relation to some of the programs that we've run recently. So we, over the last few years, ran something called the Transforming Construction Challenge. And at the heart of this, we were developing a product platform for building. So essentially, you build a building in the way that you build a car or an aircraft in the modern world. You have an interchangeable set of component parts that you can use to assemble buildings of various types. It vastly accelerates the speed of delivery. It leads to higher quality standards because these things are manufactured. Enormous sustainability benefits because you reduce waste. You can design in recyclability and all of these other things. And we took an innovation from concept to the point where it's actually being used to deliver a project in 5 years. And you can do this because the client, ultimate client, in this case it was the Department for Education that relates to schools, was involved in this from day one. They understood what was coming down the line. Their technical people were comfortable with it, their commercial people were comfortable with it, and their procurement people were comfortable with it. And that's the model that works.
Classic example where, you know, it was a joined up integrated team, and from a product or a technology perspective, absolutely. When something is a change in how society or services are delivered to society, when it's part of a broader transformational service, that's where it's really, really difficult, because it's not about a single product or a single technology. This is a fun, and procurement's role is about risk and money, whereas what we're talking about is innovation, and procurement needs to be an integral part of the innovation process as well. But yeah, I mean,
Thanks. There's another question. Yes, maybe.
I just wanted to say, in the US, having had experience with NASA, when NASA was chartered in 1958, they built in something called Other Transaction Authority, specifically for the space agency to get around the federal government's federal acquisition requirement process, because they knew, hey, we don't know how to do this space thing, and if we attach this bureaucracy to it, the Soviets are going to kick our ass, right? And so they built that in. It was later added to the Defense Department, but it's the reason that SpaceX was able to do what they did and get to the point where they're now launching once a week and providing that scale. So governments really need to bake in a mechanism, perhaps when they create a new agency or ministry, and consider giving it that authority, because the nature of it requires it.
Thank you. Yes. Go ahead. Okay, I'll pose the question. You will be the first to answer the next one. So the next question is, what's the best way to engage the private sector in resilience, specifically, both for mitigation and recovery? And what are the challenges in doing so? I want to mention an example that was alluded to in the morning with respect to cyber in Israel. Here in Israel, the cyber regulation, cyber infrastructure actually requires all the companies that work in the let's say energy infrastructure to report to a central government facility and to report in fairly detailed information of the operation of the let's say generation plant or whatever they are doing. And send, even from lower level machinery information outside to this center. This is the requirement on the regulation, actually. It was difficult to implement at the beginning, but after experience from a few attacks, whereby all the companies, private companies, for example, saw the potential benefit and the benefit from getting the information ahead of time from the others who reported the attacks. This now works very, very smoothly, actually. Everybody is happy to participate and send the information to the center, getting the trust of all the players. So it worked well. So this is just an example. And again, I repeat the question, what is the best way to engage government and private interaction for resilience? Chris, welcome.
Thank you very much, and apologies to everybody for being late, but I have my own resilience challenge to deal with in terms of getting here. I just wanted to say a quick word on the procurement point, because we're seeing this hugely in energy transition in particular, where you're trying to compare a nascent technology with a very mature technology. And the normal evolution of the energy market doesn't facilitate that nascent technology. And the government and business partnership. So I sit on the government's Hydrogen Advisory Council, and this is a vehicle by which we try to bring together how do you bring together the view of industry alongside the policymakers who need to facilitate the framework without creating unnecessary additional costs on consumers as we go through that process. I think it's a perfect example of actually, how do you create innovation and do it in a competitive landscape whilst the competitive field is somewhat slanted to the more mature historical technologies. So that's kind of, I think I'm agreeing with you there. The second point around the the relationship and the approach. I think cyber is a terrific example in my mind about how we can both get it wrong and how we can get it right. And if you look at the early days of the way that we dealt with cyber threats and cyber attacks, we created standards and we created checklists and we audited the checks and made sure that organizations were compliant. But that didn't really work in a world where actually cybercrime and cyber influence was moving much, much faster than the tick boxes that we were working with. And over here in the UK, the creation of the National Cyber Security Centre and its relationship with critical business and critical infrastructure in particular, but also there as advice to business, is an excellent demonstration, I think, about how important it is for business and government to come together in order to create a resilient framework against such threats and such attacks.
But can you be more specific? What's working now?
So what's working now, I think, is that that appreciation that actually technology is moving quicker than we can move standards.
Can you hear me?
And therefore, the reality is you need a dialogue, you need discussion, you need data, you need information, and you need to build trust in that data and in that information, so that actually you can keep that one step ahead rather than always being behind the curve, because the technology moves so much quicker. And it is vital that we do that. And I think certainly, in some parts of the world, we have got a lot better at that. I still think there's a lot of improvement that we can do, but part of that is about building up that trust and understanding consequence, and it's that mitigation of consequence. I've worked in many different parts of the energy supply chain, some of which are absolutely critical in terms of having cyber integrity within their actions, and other parts of the value chain where actually you can put in manual mitigations to a cyber attack and cyber threat. So it is about understanding your business, understanding the consequences, and then evaluating the right approach. But it starts with good knowledge, good data, and particularly in the area of cyber, I think that government-business relationship is absolutely key in that.
Anybody else wants to add on this motivating the private sector to resilience?
I could maybe talk about motivating public also to participate in resilience. I know that Microsoft had this program for hackers that if you find bugs in their system, you get money. And I find it, and I find it very smart. And I think, like, why doesn't the government do the same thing? For example, engage the public, engage private companies, just as simple as this.
Okay, let's move a little bit to green transformation, clean energy. There are some questions. Okay, maybe in the back.
Thank you. I'm young and I don't know, I have many things to learn, and I speak from a place of curiosity simply and humility. So I would like to ask, how can communication and data sharing and technology sharing regarding startups and innovations about all different fields we talked about today be facilitated in increasing rise of competition and the rise in expertise in each field? Because I'm sure many entrepreneurs and innovators are feeling that it's hard to catch up on every single on their field. And yeah, what do you think about it? Thank you.
I think it's a very good question in that, different sectors take different approaches. And so in the energy sector, there are very clear standards of capacity which define resilience in the system and that's how you plan and you develop the system. In mobile communications, the standard is set by the markets, and we have had a number of challenges and issues where that resilience has failed, and the question about whether actually regulators should put standards upon participants in the market, or whether customers are sophisticated enough to acquire that resilience. So I think it's a very active debate, but it does depend upon the sector. And I think that the start of the encouragement in terms of how do you make sure that resilience is centered. Part of it is dialogue, but part of it is setting the right market framework to which investors in business invest in the right level of resilience, and that shared understanding of what circumstances you are catering for and what circumstances you're not. So for example, again, if you take the energy sector, I think it's quite difficult over here. It was quite difficult to understand what was driving the market as we came out of COVID, unless you were very close to the global energy market and you knew what would be happening in Japan and in China and in Korea in terms of demand, what had happened in supply. In my book, it is perfectly foreseeable that actually having such a dominant gas supplier into the European market and not thinking about the consequence, about the stability of that supplier, seems slightly remiss in my view. So it's important to have that dialogue to ensure that actually you are considering the right situations and the right circumstances to take that into account. And it's incumbent on industry as knowledgeable experts to help governments around understanding consequences and make known choices rather than being subject to the great unknowns.
I think Andy wanted to follow.
Yeah, sure.
I think that's, it's an obvious example of, government or policy over-indexing on one area and under-indexing on another, right? And I think the it's very similar with certain aspects of resilience. It's like a system's only as resilient as its least common denominator. So I think the notion that from in cyber, especially in some aspects of resilience, I think it's in the best interest of all stakeholders to try to raise the level of that least sophisticated entity to help. And I think obviously there's a role for government, but there's also a role, though, I think, for industry and educating itself, if you will, and having cooperative associations. And I think that's been another area that's been successful. But as far as government policy over rotating on one area versus another, I assume we have to live with that. I just wanted to comment.
Yeah. Chris, I had the pleasure of seeing your underground 500 kV substation for the Olympics. And my point here is between a robust grid and a smart grid, I'll choose robust every time because it's self-healing. And more importantly, you don't have critical substations if no one substation is required. But to do that, you have to have long linear projects. In the U.S., the independent states, so the 50 states, can't come together on building long linear projects. Even Europe with 27 countries are closer to agreeing on the need for HVDC and long lines than the U.S. How do we get government to move to where they realize that taking land for public use is a government function and must be done in a timely fashion, or we will not have a reliable grid?
That's a good question. No, but I want to say something philosophical about the grid, your robust grid. And Udi mentioned it in the morning that we are living in a world with 8 billion people whereas maybe 100 years ago, or maybe a little more, we were 1 billion. So in a society with 8 billion people, we have to be sophisticated, and we are inherently much more vulnerable. So we don't always have the choice to be in the robust state. We would like to be in the robust state, but we have to be more efficient, and we have to pay in vulnerability for that. This is my philosophy on this question. But back to your question of the land.
I think it's very, I mean, it is interesting because land is particularly tight here in the UK, and we have some very interesting substations around the capital, and it's definitely worth a visit. But part of that is, you know, with energy transition, there's a huge number of unknowns, and one of the things that you know, we have a robust and resilient grid. It's very matrix oriented, unlike the grid that you have in Israel, and that delivers a robustness until you move all of the large-scale generation onto the extremities, and being conscious about building in that that resilience into your planning and into your system, and not just thinking about the short-term costs is absolutely vital. And you know, we have lived fantastically well off a Victorian legacy, where you might argue that they vastly over-engineered our utility infrastructure, but that has, and we've incrementally developed that, and we've done a great job in doing that. But actually, in energy transition, you need to step back, and you need a different approach, and actually, you need a very systemic view about how you deliver services to customers and how you deliver them resiliently. And I think people miss that in this great debate about, you know, what is the answer. And the trouble for government is you can get, you know, a dozen experts in a room, and every single one of them will have a different view as to what the answer is. And I think it's incumbent on us as the professionals to actually just get a little bit more honest and actually help government understand what the choices are, and what that's, you know, no one single solution is going to work. You are going to inbuild new vulnerabilities into your energy system, but you need to be aware of those so that you can invest in other technologies in order to be able to improve that situation. But we're building off a very solid legacy and foundation, as you are in the US, as you well know, Terry.
Maybe I'll sort of expand on the question. We talked about the transition to green and clean energy, and it was mentioned in previous panel. Is this an opportunity or a challenge for resilience? How should we look at it? I would like also specifically, if one of you wants to refer to the Texas incident, I think it's relevant, and also potentially to EVs and the revolution in cyber. Okay.
I'll start. Yeah, I think it's both an opportunity and a challenge, but so I guess that means it's an opportunity. I think when you're looking at, like I spoke earlier on the earlier panel, I think there is an opportunity staring at us, and it is, we have significant amount of distributed resources out there that aren't being coordinated, orchestrated, leveraged to try to create a more resilient response. That has its own vulnerabilities, but it is an opportunity that's, you know, is a byproduct, if you will, of the energy transition. I think the new capabilities there, including distributed storage, including inverter-based technologies that potentially have the opportunity to provide grid services if properly orchestrated, I think is something that needs to be leveraged. Again, I mean, obviously, there are pitfalls there, but I think there also are opportunities, right? And then as far as the, I think the challenges of, a distributed grid creates vulnerabilities in the sense of now it's more vulnerable to other types of attacks on control systems, right? But again, I'm not sure that the grid's immune from that even when it wasn't distributed, right? So I think the approach of trying to get wins in that area, at least from my perspective, is something that the industry has to do, and I don't think we've done it. I don't think we've done it, not in any country. So, anybody else want to say?
I think it's a big opportunity if we are going to enhance the energy system and adapt it to be more sustainable in the long term. It offers tremendous scope for people to innovate, develop new ways of doing things, and to, I suppose, address some of the problems that we know that we do have within the way in which our current energy system and our current energy market actually works. So I think that it is essentially an opportunity. Yes, there are a lot of challenges, and clearly as we redevelop the grid, we're going to digitize it. That creates more vulnerabilities, particularly cyber attack. But
how should the government work in order to be able to use this opportunity? What should the government do or the private sector?
I think it comes back to government playing a convening role in this. Government has got to bring together the stakeholders. I think government has got to focus on identifying what the realistic options are that fulfill a nation's or a particular geographical area's energy needs now and in the future. I think it's got to be honest with people about what the challenges are and what they realistically can and can't have. And it's got to be realistic with people about the various trade-offs that are going to be involved in some of the policy decisions that are made. And it's also, I think, as well, got to look at what the distributional impacts of some of these changes are going to be and who is going to benefit, on whom the disbenefits are going to fall, and to ensure that the transition pathway that you've got in place is ultimately affordable for society as a whole.
So it's good to have a slight contradiction, isn't it? Because I don't quite agree with that. I think, I mean, for me, the government should set the outcomes that are desired. And if that desire is sustainable, resilient energy, then that's the outcome. They should leave it to the industry to determine what, and the market, what the answers are to that. You're in danger of ruling out technologies. And the opportunity, in my mind, comes from having that systemic approach, which includes distributed demand, it includes various sources of technology. It's quite, I've been involved with the EIS now for a lot of years, and it's quite interesting how the debate has changed over that period of time. And we would have sat here articulating as experts what we felt the outcome was. But the world's changed a lot since then. My internet went down for 4 days a couple of weeks ago, and it wouldn't have mattered historically. It's now vital to my ability and my household ability to function. It's actually vital for industry to function because the whole internet has become much more distributed, which actually has added a robustness to it, which unfortunately was let down due to nature, which was kind of the challenge. But I think it's important to set that outcome. And those of us involved in energy and generation, coal is fantastically resilient. It's a really robust technology and really easy to store. And then along came natural gas, which had a flexibility to it, but actually a sensitivity that created new vulnerabilities. but together, actually, they match the needs of the market really well. And it's about having that flexibility in the way that we do things and not putting all our eggs in one basket. And that's why I think, we should be driving for outcomes and then letting that innovation come in and actually drive the solutions.
I'm not sure it can be completely free, actually. And I wanted you to refer to the Texas event, because I think the Texas event is where the market was let too free, in the sense there was not enough regulation. The outcome was clear. Okay, we want an efficient market, we want electricity, but the private market did not take into consideration something. So it is a dialogue that has to be between the government and the private sector, and government has to set not only the framework, but has to set some rules eventually and some minimum requirements. And this is at least my conclusion from Texas.
And I agree with that, in so much that there was no actor in the energy market that had the systemic view and responsibility for the system. Nobody had that sufficient influence to say, hang on a minute, all our eggs are going into one basket here. And actually, it's one of the challenges of a greater interconnected market, is that the more you interconnect it, the more there are unforeseen consequences of the actions that you take. The answer isn't to become less connected, it's actually to become more connected.
Yeah, we mentioned it, I think, in my previous panel. I certainly agree with that. So anyway, you want a quick question? We have to finish.
I'll ask a question. I'm afraid it's not quick.
We can also end the discussion with a question. It's also fine.
First of all, I think it's just too tempting to ask this because you are an excellent panel and a superb chair. But as tough as these questions are related to how do we, between government and business, how do we stimulate, how do we improve resilience? The focus up until now, I think, has primarily been on sector by sector, industry by industry. To make the question much harder, how do we look to government and business in the way they work together to create opportunities for multi-sector, cross-sector resilience, especially when we look for the most essential areas, the most extreme threats?
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah, so with that, we have to finish, unfortunately. You think about it during the evening break. Okay, thank you very much for our panelists.
Thank you. We're going on to our final panel of the evening on the rules of emergency management, non-governmental response organizations, and healthcare. We're first going to hear some remarks from General Alicia Tate-Nadeau, who's the director of Illinois Emergency Management. She was not able to attend because of dealing with a rash of tornadoes and other disasters there. But she did take the time to make some remarks, and then we'll have a discussion with Leahy chairing a discussion with Persia Payne-Hurley and Toby Wicks.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you for letting me join you virtually today. Illinois recently had 31 different tornadoes and 119 straight line winds that affected us last Friday. So as you might guess, I really needed to be here today. But for those of you that don't know me, my name is Alicia Tate-Nadeau. I'm Governor Pritzker's Homeland Security Advisor and also the Director of Illinois Emergency Management. Let me take an opportunity to thank our panelists that are here today, and of course, all of you that are attending the 2023 Resilient Renewable Planet Conference. So I've got a simple question for you. How do we put crazy back in the box? According to a study published in January of 2023 from Aon globally, we saw $313 billion in losses due to natural disasters. That same study found that $132 billion of that total was covered by insurance. That leaves a staggering $181 billion worth of uninsured losses. Those financial numbers are disheartening, but we should also consider the loss of lives. Globally, approximately 31,300 people lost their lives in 2022. That global death toll is 3 times higher than it was in 2021. In Europe alone, 19,000 people lost their lives due to heat-related deaths. And the flooding in Uganda and Pakistan were also associated with over 4,204 deaths. And in the United States in 2022, we saw 19 different billion-dollar disasters. That's 19 disasters, over $1 billion apiece. So it's not just the United States, it's a global issue that we've come here to discuss today. We as emergency managers must come up with solutions that meet today's challenges. If the trends continue, climate change will continue to occur along with violent extremist groups promoting hate and destruction here in the United States and abroad. So how do we manage the outcome of these events? The panel you are about to hear from will address global disasters and the synergies and the gaps that we must mitigate to survive in this ever-changing environment. It has been said that communications is the key tool to managing any large-scale disaster, both internally and externally. So how do we manage in a 24/7 news cycle where mis, dis, and malinformation can gain a foothold as factual within a short period of time? Well, one idea is to meld old concepts like a joint information center with data analytics that can help us to identify anomalies from approved messages and correct them in a timely manner. We should enhance our public and private partnerships also, engaging more with private industry. By the way, at my agency here at Illinois Emergency Management, we have a dedicated public-private partnership coordinator who runs our Business Emergency Operations Center. We also need to look at more volunteer organizations active in disasters. Here in the United States, we call those VOADs. We must engage our subject matter experts both in and out of government. Likely this collaborative version of a common operating picture may be part of the solution in our responses and recovery to many of our disasters. I think our cycle of preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation, and protection is and should remain an industrial standard. But we must learn how to open the aperture and apply new concepts to our tried and true ways of doing business by looking at gaps in mitigating events prior to that event occurring. In 2018, the International Residential Code showed that for every dollar spent on preparedness and mitigation, we saved $11 for every dollar to reduce risk and disaster losses. We must innovate so that we can be responsive in a better way and we can recover more quickly. Our mitigation activities will make our communities more resilient for future disasters. Let's look at from our successes here in Illinois. For the first time in IEMA's history, we now have a recovery division that provides oversight and coordination for public assistance, individual assistance, and hazard mitigation. In 2022, this new division of recovery secured over $1.3 billion in funds for individuals, municipalities, and local businesses that were affected during disasters. That's just one state's success story. Imagine if you implemented this same type of dynamic recovery program in your community. You can be the catalyst for helping your community become more resilient. Don't forget, Recovery relies on many groups and organizations, and our recovery division started regular talks with various non-governmental organizations who frequently supported communities affected by disasters. This included our ability to address and overcome language barriers, target specific at-risk communities, and vulnerable populations. But I think we can mobilize volunteers to do more. If you attend any exercise in my agency, you'll see volunteers included in all of our exercises. In fact, we have an individual and community assistance manager who regularly engages with countless volunteer groups. It all starts early, coordination before a disaster. Building these relationships before a disaster, establish and working relationships prior to a disaster, and exchanging business cards before the disaster, attending trainings with your volunteer partners, and most importantly, maintaining your level of engagement, nurture and share information regularly. Volunteers must be included in response and recovery. Take the time to recognize volunteer efforts and showcase volunteers' dedication to mission success. Volunteers are a crucial part of our community because volunteers are the heartbeat of the community. Now I'd like to turn it over to the panel chair, Lee Gan-Ni, to open this discussion amongst our panelists here today. Thank you.
They say you remember the first one and the last one. So we got the last one. So I'm very excited to host this panel and invite Persia and Toby. Have a seat. I'm Lihi. I've been working for EIS Council the past 2 years now, running the digital efforts of the council. But half of my professional life I spend as a lawyer, half of it for the private sector and half of it for the government, for the public one. So I know a lot about collaboration. The other half I spend running innovation projects, collaborating with academia and companies. So we are here to talk about collaborations and what works and what doesn't. But I'm missing today a bit of the human aspect of things. Because up there are regulators and there are policymakers and a lot of good ideas. And we would, I love those. But at the end, it goes to you guys. First responders, humanitarian organizations. So we will talk a bit today about the gaps and what was this aha moments that you were like, if I would just know that those guys could do that, we would be in a better place now. So I welcome Toby and Persia. Maybe you can tell a bit about yourself and about your experience.
Let me interrupt for just 1 second.
Just 1 second, Chris.
Just some housekeeping. As you see Mark's name up there, I forgot to mention, he had a family emergency happen and had to fly home this morning, he and his wife. So that's why he's not here, but we're so happy that Persia and Toby are here, and we wish Mark and his family the best.
First, I need to thank Avi. We love him so dearly for bringing this group together and really giving us a chance to talk about not just one area of our greatest problems and questions and solutions, but multiple. And in my current role as the Assistant Director of Partnership Engagement, North Carolina Emergency Management, I've been able to look at now the private-public partnerships that we've been building here the past 9 years, and I was honored to start that program in our state. And now I have a bit of oversight over the Community Emergency Response Team, which is a huge group of volunteers, as well as our state VAL, that would be VAL, Voluntary Agency Liaison. So that would be our connectivity before, during, after disasters. with all of the North Carolina volunteers active in disasters, or we call them VOADs, as the wonderful General from Illinois mentioned. I think it's important for me to just comment a bit on that last panel that mentioned so many different aspects of private and public, and we know that means people. And I wanted to encourage you all with a bit here at the end, since you've hung in here with us to the end, if my partners will allow, to encourage you on some private-public partnerships that included volunteers in a lot of ways that worked. And I think that we need to hear a little good news. There's been a lot of theory, I think, I call it theory, at least in the United States, about how we should do this. And I had to read a lot of that. And I think theory is good. I think that it is imaginative and innovative, and it gets us motivated. And it certainly motivated me. And I mean, I had no idea no one was actually doing this. That was the thing. When I got into this, I didn't know people were not actually doing it at that point in my state or in my country. So how to do this? One of my colleagues on the last panel mentioned, how do we do this? How do we engage the private sector? How do we get them motivated to work with government? Or how do we get government to motivate to work with them? I warn you that my biggest challenge was on the government side. Those were my biggest challenges. Those were cultural challenges. Those were traditional challenges. Those were folks that said, "Aren't you a woman? What are you doing here?" Or something like that. And I was even asked directly, "Hey, oh, nice to see you. I don't want you to be ugly, but I got no idea what you're doing here." And I didn't snap back to my old drill sergeant days. I didn't do that, honey. I said, I got to show this guy that he's on a winning team. I had to take the right attitude. But to my little story, or to one of my stories, when we talk about cross-sector coordination or cross-sector operations and how we involve the private sector, where do we even start? And I'm going to say what you already know, and that is common denominators. All of this stuff has been written. That's nothing new. How to find a common denominator. And I think that in general, I can say, especially dealing with culture and tradition, finding somebody that's trustworthy is tough. Or finding somebody that the private sector will trust is tough. But it didn't take long just to show interest in what they were doing. What was the most important things to them, and finding those common denominators with government. So if we know that when businesses stand, communities stand, this little thing that we say in North Carolina, if we know that to be true because of those symbiotic relationships, then we know that that means business has to keep going. So rather than starting a partnership with, hey, what can you do for me? I stood in front of those 70 folks that I invited to our Emergency Operations Center and had no idea why they were there. And I said, what can we do for you? What can we do to help business continue to operate? We want you to keep going before, during, and after. What can government do to support that? And that got their attention. Nobody wants business interruption. What can we do to help you take better care of your employees, to keep them safe, to get them out first, or to get your skeleton crew access back in? What can we do to help that, support that? So leaning on that, and then putting our money where my mouth was, which was tougher than you might expect, is how we were able to open that dialogue and those conversations of how we're going to do this. And to prove that I was serious, to invite some of these companies to exercise with us. So we've got the volunteer organizations, private sector, state agencies, 100 counties, and an emergency management organization, and forestry, and ag, and commerce, all exercising in one time, live on one platform, common operating picture that everybody's looking at the same time, everybody reacting to the same scenario, everybody reacting to injects that are absolutely focused on them. And what we found, and this is the important part, what we found is something that I mentioned earlier when I talked about the unknowns. We knew things, but we didn't know. Kind of like the gentleman that mentioned with the telecom, we've got these phones and we don't understand their full capability. So when the question or the inject came in this hurricane scenario, and everybody was updating on what they would do, what they could do, when we started looking at how we move 1 million meals, for instance, from Indiana, which is, I don't know, 6, 7 states away, in a flooded environment, down to far coastal North Carolina, where we had these people that were out of their homes. How do we do that? And they ran in to talk to me suddenly, and these are people that said, I don't need to be ugly, I don't know what you're doing here. You got private partners that have trucks, and we can find some ways. They were coming up with how they wanted to do it. But UPS was in the room. And UPS said, excuse me, do y'all know that we do air? We don't just do ground. We don't just ship packages. And I thought, man, I only thought of those guys as shippers, on the ground. We do air. Well, what do you suggest? Well, if you're going to move a million, and he mapped it out in 5 minutes, we can have our guys that are 2 miles away from where they manufacture these MREs, Mills Point to Eat, grab those MREs and take them to the hub, and we can fly them here. And matter of fact, we can have them to you in 4 hours. And by the way, we would charge you just the cost of the fuel. We'll have it there. Now, that is a capability that's uncovered, isn't it? Isn't that an unknown known? Someone knew it in the EEOC. Someone knew it in the EEOC, but it was unknown to government. It was unknown to others. But that's just one example. Now, those folks, because we invited them in to do that joint training, because we exposed them to everything we know, they're willing to share information with us. So we do heavy information sharing, and we exercise a lot, yes. But I think it's important to know that uncovering that capability, and because of the competitive nature of the private sector, it meant that FedEx had to one-up them. FedEx was saying, hey, wait a second, we can do something too. And it went on like that. And I'm talking about across the board. So to say I have a great relationship with Duke and Dominion, the energy companies in my state, just two of the major ones, is an understatement, because we're exchanging information all the time. Information is going to help them, information is going to help us. But it did start with trust. So I didn't mean to grandstand there, but I thought it was important after hearing that last panel that there are many, many success stories, and I'll share a few others, but I think it's important that if we're going to uncover some of these unknown knowns, then we've got to get into sharing information. And the more time we spend on some of those areas, like the unknown knowns, I think we're going to eliminate more of the unknown unknowns. If that makes sense.
Yes, it is. Toby, so you're in React. I guess you're reacting there.
Hi.
Yeah.
Toby, Chief Executive of React Disaster Response. We are an organisation, like I said, 7 years young. So 25 staff, 2,500 volunteers, 40% veteran, 40% what I call blue light, so police, fire, ambulance, 20% up for it, civilians. And maybe I'll just throw 3 grenades into the conversation to see how we get on. One of the questions I'm asked most frequently is, gosh, Toby, it must be hard deciding which needs, which crises you respond to. For me, that's really easy. We have a response activation matrix. There are 5 questions, and very, very easy. What is really hard for me is the exit strategy, because more often than not, we are deploying to treat symptoms of problems. The needs are massive. Our scale is relatively small, and we're deploying very high caliber people into quite punchy situations for free. What's not to love? I read a brilliant article by a professor at Wharton, a chap called Greg Shea. I'd recommend it to anybody. The article is titled "The Problem with Heroes." And it's a really simple point, saying it's okay to celebrate a hero once, but if we're celebrating a hero a second time for doing exactly the same thing, we've got a problem. And so this is something I experience acutely and often, deploying high caliber people to treat symptoms in broken systems and not addressing the root causes. So that's one of the things that it doesn't keep me awake at night, but I can definitely see the challenges associated. The second point, the video was great, I think, in many respects. One of the things I loved about it was the emphasis on volunteers. So React is a volunteer-led organization. And one thing that hit me, I've been part of it for 18 months, is, and it's quite sad to say it, but more often than not, volunteers are treated as the lowest of the low. and had a conversation with a retired two-star general who deployed for us during COVID. And he said to me, Toby, do you know what? Thank you. And thank you to React for giving me this opportunity, because for the first time I've learned just how rude the general public are, number one, and number two, just how they don't listen. Here was an individual with incredible experience, right? Trained through our organization and deployed as a volunteer to lean in and help. Somebody saying who had the benefits and the advantages, I suppose, of hierarchy in an organization, deploying as an unknown volunteer, right? And facing some of those challenges. So I think we've still got a lot of work to do. Yes, I believe in the power of volunteers, and I think we have a hell of a lot of work to do to try and level the playing field. So that's a second grenade. And the third, is it a grenade? I don't know. Third observation, something to talk about, is can we look at ourselves in the mirror in the morning and genuinely think about leave no one behind? Are we really thinking about the hardest to reach and the most vulnerable? And I'll just lob one data point at you just to provoke the conversation. Anybody know how many COVID-19 vaccines were administered globally? Ballpark, 13 billion. Any idea on the percentage of those that were administered in the 30 countries that have a humanitarian ongoing response? 2.5%. So a very small proportion of COVID-19 vaccines being administered in those countries where you could argue there's the greatest need because of vulnerability. So three challenges that I experience. This challenge of exit. What is the exit strategy when we're deploying to treat symptoms of broken systems? Second, the role and profile of the volunteer in the ecosystem. And then third, this idea of really holding our feet to the flames in terms of hardest to reach and most vulnerable. How's that to start?
Not bad. Very good. I have a question about COVID. We were just discussing before with Persia about, I mean, this is not the first time that the world has seen pandemic, right? I mean, we knew that this is coming and one way or another. And training in hospitals, because we're talking about the health sector as well. I'm a daughter of a I lost my dad to COVID, but he was running a hospital and they've been training all the time. It's funny that we lost this for that. But Persia was mentioning that the problem with training is that you train on things that you already know. But it's like in the university now, right? You teach students things that in 10 years, maybe nobody is going to do anything about it. So the question, how do you bring agility in, right? How do you teach people to react about the unknowns?
Thank you. A lot of the folk in my,
Oh, I said I had an idea.
There are a lot of first responders here, I know. So if you have an idea, feel free to join.
I'll go first with a quick catchphrase. A lot of the volunteers in my organization say, train hard to fight easy. And so I think that matters. And it's important. What I would also say is I think we need to think hard about incentives. A lot of the organizations that we support have an issue, definitely have an issue shouting about, and I would say even have an issue talking about preparedness. When I joined this organization, I had a delightful moment, a sort of induction. I had a number of telephone conversations or video conversations with stakeholders in the space. And I lost count of the number of times people said to me, Toby, your volunteers are remarkable. They're redefining what volunteering means. And I can't tell anyone about it because we were supposed to be doing it. And not only that, we were paid to do it. And so I think, time and again, I see us building relationships with organizations who, from my perspective, should be shouting about the extent to which they are getting ahead of the problem, the extent to which they are investing in preparedness, and yet all of the incentives seem to be aligned to them keeping very, very quiet about recognizing those investments and therefore a challenge to scale.
Oh, I think that I recognize what you're saying there. I think there's a very cool synergy between some of these private companies who have a philanthropic arm and they will partner with a volunteer organization. Maybe what they do is they will power the volunteer organization to be able to do what they do. And then let that organization kind of coordinate on a particular mission. For instance, if a home improvement store, in this case Lowe's, we have a great relationship with because they're headquartered in North Carolina, wanted to donate the materials in order to clear out a house after flooding, or in our case, it was a whole neighborhood. It was kind of like a town. And they decided that they were gonna donate all of that. But they didn't really have the manpower to put those cleaning kits together. And so the volunteer organization, and it was multiple ones, they came together to put that together. And you guys can imagine what they looked like. It was a 5-gallon bucket, it said Lowe's, it was a mop, it was a mask, it was gloves, whatever, to slop out houses. And it ended up setting up 4 instances of those giveaways with Lowe's. And I was simply a coordinator. And it was powered by private sector and it was powered by volunteers. And they had their banners and all of that up, and then we did the messaging to public of where it was. But they gave away, oh my gosh, over like 1.5 million of these kits in different locations, different Lowe's stores. But it's a good example of, at least to me, what Lowe's was doing is they gave respect to the volunteers. They had them all over their banners. They named every single group that cooperated that was there, every group. And they fed them. That was important to me as the coordinator. But I think that what it showed too was in those communities where they really needed those cleaning kits, that they were able to get them in a store near them. So it was sort of like a cooperative effort all around. But it's just one example. But to your point, giving volunteers the respect that they deserve, because these are retired professionals in most cases. That's how they are with us. They've got loads of experience. They lend to the solution rather than the problem. But I don't know if it's just a people problem, or if it is, or unless you're suggesting that we should do more to uplift them, which I think we can and we should.
I've got one more if you wait. I think there were several questions wrapped into one there. You mentioned right at the end agility, and I'd like to make a link to the last question of the panel previously, which I think was spot on, was around the challenges around multi-sectoral approaches. In the humanitarian space, we see it all the time, right? Each sector or each cluster assessing in and of its own, and then a response that meets those needs. So I think in terms of supporting agility, I'm a big fan of what I would call area-based approaches. So a better attempt or a more robust or intelligent attempt to understand the needs of an area and then match that with the appropriate supply. And I think that can help in terms of agility rather than a predefined sectoral driven response. Does that make sense?
Could you give an example?
Yeah, I've seen it in so many. Haiti earthquake 2010, classic humanitarian challenges are, and often it's allocation decisions. I think, and a related piece, right, where you have each sector in each cluster established very early on. And I think the real-time evaluation makes me laugh, real time, because I think it took 18 months. One of the headlines was too many sectorally driven responses and missing opportunities for a multi-sectoral approach. And more often than not, the needs far outweigh what the response is able to deliver anyway. And so I think that, the only wrong decision is not to move fast enough. I think too many disconnected needs assessments is a classic. So if you could think about an area-based approach rather than a sectorally driven approach, that makes a hell of a lot of sense to me. And also related to that, the transparency, right? Information sharing of the needs in near real time, superimposed with the capacity. Good ways to go.
But you said agility.
You're running now to take the questions.
I think my voice is loud enough.
No, he's gonna go up and there and you get the mic.
That's okay. I was sorry to be a bit cynical, but I was going to say, just from hearing what you're saying, it almost sounds like both UK and USA are relying on volunteers and charities. And we actually see that in the UK. We're one of the most
Or I get in trouble.
Thank you. UK is one of the most generous, in quotation marks, countries. But to be a bit, sorry to be a bit cynical, but that's because of the tax relief system that the country also has. So if a lot of corporates donate, then they get tax reliefs and so on. So, but we were saying in the previous sessions about how we can't expect corporates to rely on ethics and morals. However, we are relying on volunteer organizations to be driven purely by ethics and morals because they're not getting paid. My question is, if we rely too much on charities, how are we filling the cracks that are left because it's a decentralized system? And secondly, what can we do to remove the reliance on volunteer organizations and have volunteer organizations really just fill the necessarily small needs that the humanitarian crisis will face? Because ideally, the most of it is addressed by emergency management and governments and so on.
No, I like your question because, it's funny. I didn't see my role at the time as a private sector manager. I didn't see my role as, hey, I need to get volunteers, moving. They were already moving on their own. But I did see a huge role for private sector to step up. I saw it that way. So not that, I think there's a lot volunteers do, and I think they do a lot, but the reliance on them, I agree with you. You could have 10,000 volunteers today and you could have 3,000 tomorrow. And that's a reality. And if we are taking a we can't fail attitude, then we have to plan for that kind of situation. So I think that in general, we really do have to look at the solutions that are there that we know can be solid. And those private-public partnerships that we come up with are the kind of solid agreements where our private partners actually have roles in before, during, after disaster. They actually take on a role. So, and in terms of agility, Toby mentioned it and it's important. And I think of it as pivoting. It's kind of the same thing, right? We pivot, we stretch, and we did during the pandemic. So I look for ways to pivot, roles for the private sector, and gaps. And gaps that private sector can potentially create a solution for. So in a situation that we have all dealt with, right? Where somebody was talking about how we rely on the internet, how we rely on cell service and that kind of thing. Very scary, right? Especially to an emergency operations center and first responders. We saw during 9/11 when a lot of our communication was cut in half because of so much traffic. Well, we thought about that a lot in terms of a state that gets hit a lot by hurricanes, hit a lot by power loss, hit a lot by other restrictions on telecom. And we had to figure out a way of how do we keep going. And we're only as good as that, that last bit of power we got in the tank. That's how I see it. And we can only, if we communicate, and we can't communicate, we know that's typically the biggest downfall of any operation, that they can't communicate. So how to fix this problem? I started paying attention to a group in my backyard, Cisco Tactical. We got a lot of companies like that here. And Cisco Tactical had done some pretty amazing things during Sri Lanka. Remember the tsunami in Sri Lanka? They rolled up with their satellite buoy after Sri Lanka within, I don't know, I think it was 10 hours, 12 hours of the tsunami. And they raised that buoy and they were talking across the world, back to here, to the headquarters. And I thought, wow, that's what I'd like to have in my back pocket if I needed to talk to somebody. So when I reached out to Cisco Tactical to ask them to be partnered with the North Carolina BEOC, they became our EOC PACE. And military folks here with PACE That would be our primary, our alternate, our contingency and emergency communications. So if we are cut off, water, fire, whatever that is, Cisco Tactical has that role, filling that gap of making sure that we can communicate, not just us, but everybody in our building, which includes North Carolina Department of Transportation, the State Highway Patrol, the 24-hour communications center directly connect to our nuclear power plants. But see, they filled that role, and that was a gap that's been there for years. So I'm mentioning that because, you know, would there be volunteers if necessary to do certain things around the EOC? Yes. Do they fill a huge role? Yes, they do. Are they important to us? Absolutely. But I did make sure that they were there to train with Cisco. Why are they training with Cisco? Expanding their knowledge, right? But not to want to rely absolutely on every disaster, to your point, to be in a situation where we can't do what we're there to do.
I love your question too. I talk about resilience as a team sport, and I don't mean that in a flippant way at all, but I think the scale of the needs and the scale of the investment are so great that we all need to up our game, and it has to be a situation where 1 + 1 is greater than 2. And so I think whilst you're saying there is an over-reliance perhaps on volunteer organizations, I think we all need to step up. So that's a quick one for me.
I got one here, I got one there. I got
Yeah, that was well said. And it takes the holistic piece to actually accomplish these kind of catastrophes to come out of that. And to speak to Dr. Wick's points about volunteer not being supported, just a couple of stats. We keep talking about first responders and we keep talking about volunteers. 70% of all of our firefighters in the United States are volunteers. Our fire chief makes $350 a month, and it went up from $50 after our catastrophic wildfires. Okay, so you have to understand that it's a very large, broad piece to the volunteer piece of that. Additionally, 14 cents a mile is the exchange rate or the reimbursement rate for volunteers. It hasn't changed since 1998 as a statute for charitable organizations. That is not supporting those kind of systems. And those systems are what give leverage and build capacity for these kind of situations. So I really want to encourage government and other groups to support the volunteers. I do want to point out too, for us in Washington State, we had wildfires. We've had over 215,000 hours with 2,500 volunteers. And at $20 an hour, that equals $4.3 million in just the last few years in our wildfire recovery. These people come from all over the country, give their donations of time and money, and they support and change the lives of survivors. So it also comes to PTSD, to behavioral health issues. So anyway, I just really want to say, it really makes me happy.
Thanks. Great. You want to? I got another question here, but
I like that. The use of volunteers that you mentioned. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You had another comment?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I said 200. They were pointing out that I did the wrong. They did their stats. This is my volunteer coordinator. She was doing the issues, but 2,500 volunteers in the last couple of years.
It's also quite relative because it's a small number compared to what you were talking about, but this is a county of 46,000 people only.
Correct.
So the county is 40, it's a small population of people. So
Okanagan County, 46,000 people, but people come from all over the world to help. And I'm sorry, what was your question?
Oh, great, sorry, I was gonna say, I've learned that you can also, if you're clever enough and you have enough cupcakes, because I like to say that's the currency in our PEOC. If you have enough cupcakes, you can get volunteers out of the private sector. So out of our BEOC, there was a, I'm trying to figure out how to do this, but I got a nice sit down with some
nice coffee and some cupcakes with the structural engineers of North Carolina, civil engineers, electrical engineers, and the architects of North Carolina. Sat them all down and I asked them with some real high-level cupcakes, would they consider, lending their expertise to the state of North Carolina, especially in recovery, because we have a lot of massive floodings and a lot of damage and a lot of people as a result then sheltered by the state, which means we're doing everything for those folks, which means all of the wraparound services. We're feeding, we're doing mass shelter, we're doing mass mental health, we're doing everything. We have even done, mass pharmaceuticals. We've done all of this medical care. How do we get those folks back going on the recovery if their houses have been flooded and we're sitting there with counties that might have what, 1 or 2 inspectors or 3 or 4? I mean, I'm sure you guys have seen some of those little places too. Well, these great folks from the structural engineers and civil engineers and architects listen to that. And then of course, the question becomes, what's in it for me? And I know what he's going to say because he pumps up volunteers. What's in it for me? So what did I have to go by then? I said, well, you get to be a hero, right? At least once. You get to do something outside of your firm. You get to do something that is outside of the norm. You may not be, building a house today. But what if you got to deal with some type of interesting disaster, something unusual? Get that badge. I got badges. I buy badges. Give badges away. What can you do to help us? Now, of course, y'all know because they're professional and they're licensed, they're concerned about liability. So we needed to come up with a memorandum of agreement that made sense. In our memorandum of agreement, they are identified as volunteers of the state. I'd set up a training program for them next. Well, we needed to train them on ICS. That's what we used. We needed to train them on that. We trained them on that. We also brought in somebody that was approved by FEMA to teach them, to give them a review of structural assessment process. Now, these guys were all doing license, most of them. They did rail, they did road, they did buildings, they did historical landmarks, they did all these kinds of different things in their profession. And in the end of it, we had so many volunteers and we have upped their training every year that now we got about roughly, just in my state, about 256 in this program. They deployed for the first time under the North Carolina banner during Hurricane Matthew. And during that disaster, they inspected dams, they inspected roads, they inspected rail overpasses, and they inspected about 454 homes in 4 days, just blitzed this whole town. And those people got to go home and start mucking out their houses and start the recovery. That meant they were out of shelters. That meant they were off the state or off the jurisdiction. That meant that they were now putting money back into the economy. That meant that they were now trying to help their schools get open and trying to help their businesses, and businesses were getting open too. But that whole community standing up together because those engineers were out there that day or that evening until it was done. And they have sensed EMAC, which is the mutual aid we have, to the Puerto Rico hurricanes. They were there. Then the Alaskan earthquakes, they were there. This is just one volunteer group, but they were born out of these firms, multi-firms, and now they deploy. Now here's the gravy that I didn't expect. The coolest thing, because I look for gaps. Our urban search and rescue teams, guess what they never had? We never had an engineer or an architect in their back pocket that had collapse expertise and was collapse licensed. They never had that. Suddenly, they have that now. They can deploy 24 hours, doesn't have to be a declaration of emergency, and they can go with the urban search and rescue team. So it was a win-win all around. They're volunteers, but they came from private.
Let me just interject something.
Yes, sir.
I have to say, what you are achieving as emergency managers in providing the services you provide and providing the leadership to enable volunteers to be effective is absolutely remarkable, and I think represents a model for everything we've been talking about today. Because what was the last question which you dealt with casually because you achieve it, Toby, regularly? How do you deal with multi-sector resilience? Well, we do that. We do it, get them together for an area or presumably a region or maybe even a nation. You guys know how to motivate people and you succeed in bringing people together across all sectors. I think what you're achieving, we need to find ways, and you, incidentally, you also do it internationally, right? Emergency management are volunteers and services provided internationally. So you successfully access something within people that brings out the very best. And I think if you can help us understand how we can take that and use it not just for the kinds of conventional disasters that you face all the time, but help us to understand how we can access that same place in people and across all the different sectors to prepare for, not wait for the ultimate disaster when it'll be too late, prepare for them and bring people together. I think what you guys do represents really a very important hope across all the sectors.
Definitely agree. Can we just have we need to wrap up soon. I want to make sure we have time for one more question and we'll get.
Well, it's more a comment than a question. I just wanted to say in the US, a lot of times when we talk about volunteer organizations, we talk about faith-based organizations. And the reality of the faith-based organization is that these groups are decreasing in membership across the board. Churches, temples, mosques, their memberships, not only are they decreasing, but their membership is aging. You were saying there were a lot of retired people that volunteer. So as they age, they're not able to volunteer due to physical restrictions. So I'm thinking, it sounds like besides cupcakes, we need to think of some different recruitment methods to get some of our younger and more able people to volunteer to be first responders. We also had the issue that first responders, people in public health positions are aging out. If you look around the room, how many of us have gray hair? We're going to all be retiring. So we need to train up those who are going to be leading behind us, as well as those volunteer organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to make a comment about what Avi said. We've been talking at EIS a long time now about lesson learned and lesson that we can imagine. I think to your question, when you see something really bad happens in front of your eyes, you feel much more eager to join, to jump in and say, okay, what do you need to do? Okay, you need planes to fly to the other side of, we can do this. You need people to be sent to the hospital, we can do this. We were very brave when pandemic started. Everyone was clapping to all the nurses and all the hospitals, because when you can see it happening, it's much more complicated to convince people to collaborate, because the first question is, what's in it for me? And the cupcake is a very good example, because it is, because at the end of the day, when you come to a table to have a conversation about, okay, this is what I can bring to the table, and this is what you can bring to the table. So at the end, if it's tax, right, you donate to NGOs and you get the tax back, or for example, you get free students, right, to run projects for you, Washington, because they find the benefit. They could add a line to their CV and they feel that they're doing something meaningful. But at the end, this is our role to find a way to see that urgent things happening, right, before they happen. And I think this is a lot of the work that we put a lot of efforts in our EIS. And that's it. I hope you had a nice 2 days, and we're going to see you tomorrow, right? Thank you, Toby. Thank you, Persia. You're amazing. And tomorrow is our last day. We're going to finish at 3:30, right? That Christopher. Thank you. Enjoy London tonight.
I clearly need some. Maybe too.
Yes, maybe there's still something downstairs.